Well, welcome everyone to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts April stated meeting, and it's really a delight to see all of you here today in our home at 87 Mount Vernon Street. I am Bob Ellison, the president of the Colonial Society, and our guest is Betsy Klimasmith, who is a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, and she was also the associate editor of the New England Quarterly, and soon to be the editor of the New England. Is that right?
No.
No? Okay. She's the associate editor of the New England Quarterly, which we are delighted to have her with us. And she's going to be talking about her most recent book, and there are flyers outside for those who would like to purchase a copy of it, a discounted copy of it. Her first book was At Home in the City on Urban Domesticity in American Literature and Culture. And her most recent book, which she will be telling us a bit about today, is called Urban Rehearsals and Novel Plots in the Early American City. So welcome, Betsy Klimasmith.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. And thank you all so much for coming today. I was saying I don't know, except for my students, it's been a long time since I had an audience with real people in it, and I really appreciate it. And to those of you who can't be here today, I'm glad that you can be with us virtually. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to discuss my work with you here at 87 Mount Vernon Street. And as you'll see, it's the perfect place for me to talk about some of the Boston-based research I did for my new book, Urban Rehearsals and Novel Plots in the Early American City. Urban Rehearsals focuses on what I like to call the city before the city. The project got its start at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, where I was part of a summer seminar on newspapers and periodicals in early America. David Nord was one of the conveners, and one of our seminar days focused on the print media surrounding the 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. An epidemic seemed unimaginable at the time. This was long ago. And so at the time, I was struck by the way in which people living in 1790s Philadelphia, which had a population of only 44,000 residents and covered just a fraction of William Penn's gridded plan, how much they thought of themselves as city people. As a literary historian, I was familiar with the ways in which literature circulated in this era, in books and in magazines that brought readers a variety of essays, poems, reviews, and fiction that connected them to cities, especially to London. But as I moved beyond the literary, I immersed myself in research on material culture and architecture that showed how people around the Atlantic Rim shared cosmopolitan culture through literature, but also through food and drink, through songs, through games, through fashions. Their shared practices helped them to become or to remain city people, especially in their homes, even as the towns around them grew far more slowly. We can get a real sense for this here on Mount Vernon Street. And if you approach to 87 Mount Vernon from either direction, but I think especially if we come up from lower down on Beacon Hill, you can appreciate the unusual 30-foot setback that was required in the original 1799 deed. In the early 1800s, this neighborhood would have been filled with the sights and sounds of mansions being built on pasture land purchased from John Singleton Copley by the Mount Vernon proprietors Harrison Gray Otis, Jonathan Mason, Dr. Benjamin Joy, and Hepzibah Swan. These townhouses offered their illustrious owners luxurious homes. Completed in 1805, 87 Mount Vernon gives us not just a sense, but really immerses us in the architectural style that typified elite urban living in post-revolutionary Boston. In addition, the house allows those of us who are here in person a unique opportunity to imagine interiors of townhouses around the Atlantic Rim. But however similar this interior was to other urbane homes near and far, it was still surrounded by pastures, grazing animals, and neighbors who would have ranged from Boston's most elite to the town's most impoverished. If an urbane Boston existed in the late 1700s, it really only did so indoors. Though people in Boston were connected to their peers in Charleston, Kingston, and London, among other places, through their homes, Boston is often seen as a special case when it comes to its urbanity, especially in the world surrounding theater. There are reasons for this that I'll talk about a little bit later in my talk, but suffice to say, you could write an excellent book on Atlantic Rim performance culture in this era, as my colleague at Northeastern University, Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, did with her book New World Drama, The Performative Commons in the Atlantic World, and only mentioned Boston 4 times. In my own research, as my own research on early U.S. cities and novels progressed, I thought, well, here I am in Boston. And the famously first American novel, The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, was written and printed here in Boston, so why don't I start there? Well, one reason was because I did not really have a lot to say about The Power of Sympathy. First, if you've read it, you'll know this is not a novel where very much happens. Reading it is a bit like watching Bridgerton on Netflix if you're familiar already with 18th century fiction, and especially with the marriage plot. If two characters hate one another, then they will end up together. If they fall in love and easily overcome apparent obstacles like class differences, they will end up being, unbeknownst to each other, siblings. The Power of Sympathy follows the sibling storyline, with lovers Harrington and Harriet learning too late that they are half-siblings, shocking knowledge that leads to Harriet's unfortunate death. Brown's writing style doesn't leave a literary critic a lot to work with. Julia Stern accurately describes The Power of Sympathy as, quote, overwrought and artificial, ventriloquized from English and continental 18th century fictions by Stern and Goethe. And even with a deep interest in the novel's Boston setting, I could find few descriptions of the town to work with, alas. So the most interesting thing to me about the novel at first was the Paris-Morton scandal associated with it. Many of you will be familiar with Morton's legal career and political positions, and probably the scandal as well. Together with his wife, poet Sarah Wentworth Apthorpe Morton, there's a mouthful, Paris-Morton held on to his cosmopolitan proclivities through the vicissitudes of the Revolution. After the Revolution, the Mortons purchased the gracious home of Sarah's loyalist uncle, who had returned to England, on a recently renamed State Street, formerly King Street, on the recently renamed State Street, which had formerly been King Street. The Mortons lived on State Street, not far from where we sit today, until 1796, when they moved to a villa in Dorchester, whose design is often attributed to Sarah Morton's cousin, Charles Bulfinch. Small world. I like to think of 87 Mount Vernon as offering us a sense of both spaces, fitting in with the Mortons' 18th century townhouse and gesturing forward to their Bulfinch-designed country home. But in 1789, the Mortons were still living on State Street, in a household that included their 5 children, assorted servants, and Sarah's unmarried sister, Fanny Apthorpe. Fanny and Paris-Morton had a relationship that produced 1 child and eventually led to Fanny's suicide, and there's speculation that she was pregnant with a 2nd child at the time. It's common to think about this scandal as the inspiration for the novel. On Wikipedia, for instance, one can learn that the novel is, quote, based on the real-life affair. But in fact, the scandal is little more than a footnote in the novel, which for the most part imagines the next generation. Paris-Morton's legitimate and illegitimate children, fictionalized as Harrington and Harriet, who of course are ignorant of their connection to one another, falling in love, and doomed to repeat the sins of their father. I began to think about the novel then as a kind of speculative fiction, a way for Brown to imagine the future Boston that his generation would shape and that Morton's children, who were babies at the time, would inherit. I wanted to find a way into that Boston and into that house, and my portal into that world was the novel. But not really the novel's words. The best way to enter the Mortons' home through The Power of Sympathy was through the novel's frontispiece, an engraving by Samuel Hill that highlights the scandal by depicting a swooning Ophelia, and that was the name by which Fanny Apthorpe was known in the press, above a quotation from the text, "Oh, fatal, fatal poison." In a novel low on description, Hill's engraving is full of specific details that set the suicide in a townhouse resembling the one we're in today. If we weren't here, I would show a picture of the frontispiece. But since we're here, I can tell you what it looked like. The room has high ceilings, tall windows festooned with heavy drapery, an ornately framed mirror, patterned carpets, and carved wooden Chippendale-style chairs, that's not exactly right, but pretty close, that all help set set the scene for Ophelia's demise. With these objects, the engraving takes us inside the intimate spaces of what has to be the Morton home. But how could engraver Samuel Hill have known what their house looked like? He may simply have been depicting a generic room that boasted the furnishings any wealthy Atlantic Rim family would typically have owned in the period. But when combined with the name Ophelia, who everyone knew was Fanny, and the inscription, "O fatal, fatal poison," these details promise that the novel to come would explore the inner workings of the home, a promise William Hill Brown did not exactly keep. At least not in the novel. The literary form Brown and others used to get into the Mortons' home, figuratively and in some cases literally, was drama. And as I continued my research, plays related to the Mortons became some of my most important and interesting sources. So, like many of their elite peers, the Mortons loved drama, but public performance was a tricky business in 18th century Massachusetts, thanks in part to a 1750 theater ban that outlawed public performances. And in 1767, after the Sugar, Stamp, and Townshend Acts were passed, a second ban on stage plays and other theatrical entertainments reinforced the colony's rejection of British mercantile and cultural dominance. But theater did not disappear. Costume protests like the Boston Tea Party took theater to the streets. Incidents like the Boston Massacre were imagined as dramatic tableaus after the fact. Printers churned out short satirical farces conceived as closet dramas to be read aloud privately, typically read in homes, coffee houses, they could be read in colleges, or in members-only assemblies, maybe even here. No. But these plays also circulated as pamphlets and broadsides, adapting the literary forms of the British stage, especially the farce, to a range of political positions. These theater bans and Bostonians' workarounds foreshadowed national trends. By October of 1774, the Continental Congress voted to close playhouses throughout the colonies. Yet theater persisted. When the British Army occupied American cities, they brought all kinds of cosmopolitan entertainments, including balls, masquerades, and stage plays with them to brighten the winter months. No longer an exception, occupied Boston, Jeffrey Richards notes, became, quote, the scene of an active theatrical life as public plays were briefly legalized and venues such as Faneuil Hall were transformed into theaters. After the Revolution, public performances of plays were once again banned in Massachusetts until 1794, when the Mortons and their friends funded and opened the Federal Street Theater. But in the meantime, drama enthusiasts like the Mortons had to find other ways to indulge their passion for plays, and they did this in part by bringing plays into their homes. In my research on the Power of Sympathy, I came across 4 plays connected to the Mortons that shed fascinating light on their world, at least to me. Because by this point in the story, I was feeling like the novel was just a gateway to reconstructing a sense of how more varied forms of literary expression, including plays, were shaping my sense of Boston as an urban space, even in the face of strong anti-urban feeling in the years after the Revolution. It's not surprising, perhaps, that a cosmopolitan like Perez Morton would be invested in drama, but the Mortons were unusual in many ways. What surprised me was how thoroughly the literary structures of drama infused the way even more famously virtuous Americans, even in drama-hostile Massachusetts, imagined themselves through writing. One patriotic couple spent much of the early 1780s involved in an epistolary conversation about the worrisome courtship of their daughter by a cosmopolitan fellow with a questionable past. As the husband, who was on business in Europe that made him a distant observer of the events playing out at home, wrote to his wife, quote, "A youth who's been giddy enough to spend his fortune or half his fortune in gaieties is not the youth for me. Let his person, family, connections, and taste for poetry be what they will. I am not looking out for a poet nor a professor of belles lettres." His wife, however, was less certain that the suitor's character was unredeemable. She found his, quote, disposition exceedingly amiable. "He enlivened their winter evenings," she wrote. Quote, "His conduct has been regular and his manners pure." The question that seems to have preoccupied the couple as they contemplated their daughter's future was whether her suitor really was the virtuous man he now appeared to be. Describing their daughter's interest in the man in question, the mother wrote, quote, "It was not the superficial accomplishments of dancing, singing, and playing that led her to a favorable opinion of him. She knew him not when those were his favorite amusements. Nor has he ever been in the practice of either since his residence in this town. Even the former beau has been converted into the plain-dressing man, and the gay, volatile youth appears to become the studious lawyer. Has the former beau really been converted into the plain-dressing man? Or is it more probable that the gay and volatile youth only appears to become the studious lawyer? I'm reminded here of Samuel Richardson's avowal in his preface to Clarissa that his novel aims, quote, to warn children against preferring a man of pleasure to a man of probity, on that dangerous but too commonly received notion that a reformed rake makes the best husband, because the novel reveals a rake never will, never can reform. In real life, though, this suitor seems to have been both, a man of probity and a man of pleasure, a beau and a studious lawyer. I'll return to this little drama later, but now back to Perez Morton, another man of probity and pleasure. Of the 4 plays I found that related to the Mortons, 3 were play scripts that were not intended to be, 3 were play scripts that were not intended to be performed on stage, but to be read aloud in private places, perhaps in a room very like the one we're in today. They are topical farces intended as a kind of ephemeral satirical comment on the issues of the day, featuring real people and types reminiscent of the gay, volatile youth and plain-dressing man. Today I'm going to focus on the 2 plays that take us inside the Mortons' home. The first, Sans Souci, alias Free and Easy, or An Evening's Peep into a Polite Circle from 1785, dramatizes and pokes fun at the uproar over the Mortons' attempt to start a private social club called Sans Souci, which was named after Frederick the Great's summer house and modeled on similar groups in Europe and New York, where participants could dance, play cards, and show off the latest fashions. So we can think of all of those habits that the studious lawyer has left behind. A brief play with the slightest of plots, Sans Souci revolves around an entertainment the Mortons plan to stage in their house. As the action of the play moves from Madame Importance's drawing room, that's Sarah Morton, to the hall where the event is taking place, readers enter the Mortons' house just as they would later through the Power of Sympathy. The Mortons, here called Monsieur and Madame Importance, are shallow, rank-conscious, obsessed with clothes, display, and sex. As Mr. Importance leeringly remarks of the ladies, quote, "It is a pity to sully one luster amid such a cluster of charms, but taste and etiquette must be complied with, however fatal the consequences may be to beauty," unquote. This unflattering portrayal exposes the private lives of the Mortons, who mingle with characters modeled on prominent 18th century figures, including Mercy Otis Warren and Catherine Macaulay, who's called Republican heroine, as well as more generic types, Jemmy Satirist and Mr. Bon Ton. Sans Souci may well have been read aloud as a closet drama inside a genteel Boston home, perhaps even the Mortons' own. We can picture them laughing at the foibles of their friends, and maybe even themselves, as part of an enjoyable evening, maybe among the very people at whom Sans Souci poked fun. So the terms of this satire are very clear. There may have been a revolution of sorts, but for the elite urbanites of the former colonies with the war over, it is pleasure as usual. Characters rave about card parties, entertainments, and even lectures on love by, quote, the celebrated Dr. Graham. The celestial bed, ha! Here the cupids would nestle on the downy pillows, unquote. Dr. Graham's celestial bed was a tilted, electrified bed that was under a mirrored ceiling, and it was guaranteed to cure sterility and restore virility. And this is a phenomenon in 1780s London, in part because of the bed, but also because Dr. Graham had scantily clad women who would help him promote the bed. It's true. And as it become quite clear to Bostonians by 1788, the real Mr. Importance, Perez Morton, did not need Dr. Graham's help to invigorate his seductions. Another hallmark of transatlantic cosmopolitanism that Sans Souci stages is black servitude. Black servants appear in Sans Souci, highlighting that the play is set in a world of privilege and critiquing this sphere through the voices of the oppressed. In Act 3, servants Cuffy and Jack complain that their masters have begun to keep fashionably late hours that require them to work until midnight rather than 10 o'clock. Jack, who has traveled to London, explains that these new habits mark Boston as a cosmopolitan city. I'm going to spare you the dialect that marks these characters as black, but suffice to say that Jack's speech mentions numerous objects and practices that link Boston to London. Masquerades, pantomimes, tea drinking, burning flambeaux that let parties go on into the night, and liveried servants to drive partygoers home in the early morning hours. Sans-Souci's publication provoked a spirited debate in the Boston papers that was copied to Salem, Worcester, and New York. Isaiah Thomas, the printer and promoter of the Power of Sympathy, noted in his paper, The Massachusetts Spy, that, quote, on account of the attack with the printers, it met with a very rapid sale, the play, that is. Thomas would not forget how this print debate helped to sell the play. He would use a similar tactic to promote Brown's literary representation of the biggest Morton family scandal. Some writers, including Isaiah Thomas, contributed to the print debate over Sans-Souci under their real names. Others assumed humorous fictional names like Son of Candor and Sans-Souci. Writers thus became characters whose words could come to life when read aloud in homes, printers' shops, or coffee houses. This print conversation, I think, mirrors the closet drama genre of Sans-Souci. But while the newspapers gave voice primarily to powerful white men, the closet drama offered a medium through which a more heterogeneous set of voices, like those of black servants, might be heard, even if their words were written and spoken by the white elites whom they served. Sans-Souci invited the play's readers and audience into the Mortons' home, turning the Mortons into characters who could be voiced and known by people they might never encounter in their exclusive social circle. 2 years later, in 1787, William Hill Brown again opened the Mortons' home to the public with his farce Occurrences of the Times. This play ostensibly concerns a proposed duel between Charles Apthorpe, who was Fanny and Sarah's brother, and Perez Morton. But the characters in the play turn out to be far less concerned about the deadly contest than they are over a soon-to-be-published novel about the affair, Brown's then forthcoming novel, The Power of Sympathy. In Occurrences, a black servant named Debauchee introduces the power of sympathy by remarking of his master, Mr. Sidney, who is Morton. He is swearing and tearing about a novel coming out next week called The Trumpets of Nature, and he'll be damned if you don't blow everybody's brains out. Unquote. Just as Brown's audience would immediately have identified Sidney as Morton, they would have understood that Debauchee's Trumpets of Nature referred to the Power of Sympathy's subtitle, Triumph of Nature. In an 18th century version of product placement, the novel's imminent publication is mentioned 5 more times in this very short play. Its damaging potential is highlighted by Mr. Positive when he and Mr. Dupe meet in the street. Quote, and those damn scoundrels steady and firm are printing a novel that will brand him a villain centuries to come. Mr. Sidney, who's Perez Morton, then imagines his son, quote, reading a book where his father is branded with the appropriate epithet of villain. Bridging Boston's public and private worlds, Brown's novel threatens Morton, Sidney, both immediately and kind of across time. But in the context of the play, this repeated fear that the novel will somehow brand Sidney as a villain forever seems ironic, or at least curious. Sidney does not want to be known to posterity as Ophelia's seducer, but the play's epigraph claims that everybody already knows. Quote, no longer by vain fear or shame controlled, in guilty amours grown securely bold, mocking rebuke, they brave it in our streets, and blank, 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 blank. Even at noon, his mistress meets. So public in their crimes, so daring grown, they almost take a pride to have them known. Boston streets have become a stage where a scandal becomes performance. Within Boston, Morton's story can be contained, it seems, but he's afraid that publication will define him as a scoundrel to readers across time and space, including perhaps his son. Unlike Sans-Souci, which takes place completely indoors, Occurrences of the Times is comprised of a series of short scenes that lays a path through Boston. A geography of gossip connects interiors and exteriors, homes and streets, and neighbors to one another across class and racial lines. The news that the neighbors repeat is not about the scandal or even about the duel. They remain focused on the news that a published novel will open their local story to the reading world. As the play ends, however, Brown demurs on the novel's power. When the servant, Tipsy, brings Ophelia's baby on stage, she innocently, perhaps, remarks to Mr. Sidney, quote, "It looks for all the world like you." The child's appearance confirms Sidney's paternity, which Brown dramatizes in a face-to-face interaction where Tipsy delivers this quasi-verdict. Brown refuses to state outright that the baby is Sidney's, and the drama thus concludes by reinstating the intimate dynamics of a Boston where everyone knows each other so well that parentage can be read in a baby's face. The plays relating to the Mortons emphasize that performing, writing, and publishing an intimate sexual scandal renders a space more urban. Each play offers imaginative access to the elite world from inside the Mortons' own house, allowing the audience to witness or, through reading aloud, become versions of the Mortons themselves. Simultaneously public and intimate, the plays show us the power of print to produce and broadcast a local scandal over space and time. As they document a struggle between local and cosmopolitan ways of being, they both critique and compel Boston's transition toward an urban future. But crucially, the Boston these plays dramatize is not yet a city. It is still a town where people meet face to face. The Power of Sympathy would imagine a future in which the Mortons and their children will end up being punished, actually, for their cosmopolitan practices. I'm going to have a little drink of water. These plays allowed me a new take on the novel. And in part, that's because they give speaking roles to in famous women who did have voices in the public sphere, like Mercy Otis Warren, Catherine Macaulay, Sarah Wentworth Morton, who was well known in her day as a poet, as well as black characters and servants whose voices are rarely heard in literature from New England in this period. Again, these plays were written by white authors, but black characters play crucial roles on stage. And given the ways in which black servitude and slavery have largely been written out of New England's literary history, and I'll just say in terms of history, I want to just mention how significant Jared Hardisty's book on freedom was for me as I was writing this chapter. These plays seem to me significant sources in writing a black presence back into early Boston's literary history. And then there's the fact of the plays themselves. Even in a town where plays could not be performed, drama was emerging as a significant literary form, or maybe remaining a significant literary form, that allowed political debates and scandals to be acted out and satirized in a multivocal mode that resembles newspaper debates. Or maybe it's the other way around. I'll conclude by returning to the courtship tale of the gay, volatile youth, aka the studious lawyer. As many of you have probably guessed, the suitor in question was Royal Tyler, who in real life seems, like Paris Morton, to have been both a man of probity and a man of pleasure. At the time, Tyler was courting Nabby Adams, whose parents, Abigail and John Adams, and brother, John Quincy Adams, breathed a collective sigh of relief when Nabby eventually rejected him to marry John Adams' secretary. I want to point out again how much the Adamses, and especially Abigail's, conceptions of character sound like characters, the kind that we saw in these plays. Abigail signs her letters with the pseudonym Portia, aligning herself with the heroine of the most frequently performed play in the colonies and early U.S., The Merchant of Venice. Clearly, Abigail knew Shakespeare's plays and identified with his heroines, at least one. And here we see a little bit how drama helped to structure people's understanding of the world and themselves in the 18th century, even in Massachusetts. Royal Tyler was crushed when Nabby rejected him as a suitor in 1785. He was so depressed, he moved to Jamaica Plain. But by 1787, he'd recovered enough to travel to New York and attend his first staged play, A School for Scandal, in New York's John Street Theater. Immediately afterward, he dramatized the story of a drippy, sentimental heroine's rejection of the libidinous, two-timing Billy Dimple for the overly stalwart, I always think of Sam the Eagle, Henry Manley, in his 1787 comedy The Contrast, the first play written by an American to have been performed on a U.S. stage. The Contrast famously takes viewers inside a New York City home from their seats in the theater. But knowing what we know about Royal Tyler's story and his relationship with Nabby Adams, we might ask, was it really a home in New York? Or was Massachusetts more cosmopolitan, Boston more theatrical on the inside than we have come to believe? That's my talk. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm happy to talk more about the paper, this topic, if you have questions. I feel a little rusty on my... Yes.
In the course of your presentation, you said you were going to spare us the dialect.
Yes.
Are you sparing us the dialect for the sake of saving time
No.
and compressing?
No, I was sparing you the dialect because the dialect sounds a lot like kind of blackface minstrelsy. It's very rough. And this is something that it was a little bit surprising to me to see in these plays because most of the work that I'm familiar with on minstrelsy happens is kind of a little bit later. Yeah, and so no, I just didn't feel right about reading it aloud.
Well, if you move back in time to other written sources, what would their rendering of black speech be like? And kind of another way of approaching it is, how closely did the white authors listen to black speakers and attempt some verisimilitude in their rendering?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's really hard to know. I think what was one thing that was surprising to me about it was how similar it kind of looks on the page and reads to later renderings of black dialect. It's interesting to me that there's a difference, and this is something I hate to tell you, I think I got wrong in the book, but I think I got right today. The servant Tipsy at the end, who recognizes the baby, I thought was another black servant or slave. But now I don't think so, because her language is different. It is not in the same dialect. It's in dialect, but it's not the same as the black servants, who I'm identifying as black both by that dialect and also by their names. So Cuffy and Jack, then Debauché. These I think are renderings of slave or black servant names. Yeah.
Because there's an article, probably Journal of Negro History, that deals with the speech of blacks in colonial America, as rendered. And then I'm thinking of the smallpox inoculation controversy, which was again earlier.
Yeah.
It's my sense that Mather, who was defending himself against charges that he had come up with this tomfool idea of inoculating people, that he was defending himself against that. That he didn't simply wake up on the wrong side of the bed and bump his head at this idea. So he renders a conversation with Onesimus in which he tries to capture what an African-born guy might have sounded like when he was trying to grapple with, grasp, negotiate, as the French say, in English. And it's my sense that to the extent that Mather was successful in rendering verisimilitude is the extent to which he lent his advocacy of smallpox inoculation credible. Now, some of that may have had to do with language, but some of it may have dealt that Onesimus says, Mather, or in the conversation, asked him, have you ever heard of anybody doing this? And he says basically, oh yes, so my people have been doing this for hundreds of years. Then it proceeds to describe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm definitely, I've been writing this down as you've been speaking, because I've really been looking, excuse me, you can go ahead, I'm going to just have to have a little more. I know. I think I've been really looking at this in literary texts and not so much in historical texts and texts that are meant to be performed rather than read. But I think it's important, and it's always important for me anyway to remember how much writing would have been read aloud anyway. Right. I mean, just in a time when there wasn't a lot of light, for instance, to read by, or time to read, or availability of print. I mean, so I think that's a really useful suggestion for me to kind of look at some of these other renderings of Black speech for sure.
So I had another experience,
Mm-hmm.
totally unrelated to colonial, but most everybody in the room has heard the story of Hurricane. And she wrote and died.
Yes.
And there was a play that appeared in this one-time only periodical called Fire. And the play was color struck. Title was color struck, 1925. And when I was an early graduate student at Florida State University, I was working with a group of students who had what they call the Black Players Guild. And I persuaded Kathy Bulger, who's now the folklore maven at the Library of Congress, but she was a Florida folklore professor, to include a reader's theater version, which is what you're describing as these closet.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Things reminded me of approximately reader's theater. And so we took the group down to White Springs, Florida, and they were the banquet, one of the acts in the banquet. And most of these were urban Black kids, Miami, Jacksonville. When we were preparing for them, they were so uncomfortable with the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
They were so uncomfortable. Because for me, it was bi-dialectical. That was somewhat amusing.
Yes.
Just a very practical question.
Sure.
How long were these plays?
short, quite short. So I would say they were maybe 20-ish pages, but with lines. I mean, they look like a play. Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh,
but
yes.
Someone have a burgundy car outside.
Oh, that's probably. You want me to move it?
Yes, please.
And just another quick question.
Say
So did you find many instances of these actually being done in homes?
Well, again, this is one of these things that's hard to trace, but that's what they were for. But they were available to buy by regular people also, right? So it's a sort of in between form, and so that when Isaiah Thomas talks about the newspaper debates, like more people wanted to buy these play scripts. What did they do with them? I think this one of the reasons I wanted to talk about these plays today, besides the fact that this place is so perfect, and wouldn't it be fun to put on some closet dramas and really get the experience of trying this out and seeing what it feels like, is because I feel like this is some of the most interesting material, that I worked on with this project, and I'm hoping to keep working on it. I have an essay coming out this summer on some more Revolutionary era drama in Boston, but I think I feel like that's the next frontier, is really thinking about how they were used, how often people did them. There's some great research on what I would call kind of more like amateur theatricals that people would put on that were really like a staged, thing. And those are more, the ones I'm more familiar with are from the 19th century. So they're later on. So people having even pretty involved costumes and props and things, right? Performing as if they're on a stage. That's not what these were meant to be, and I think that's one of the things I need to be looking toward as I keep going. Yeah. Yes?
To whom do you credit authorship of Sanssouci?
I don't know who wrote it. I don't know. Do you? I don't know.
I suspect Mercy Otis Warren.
I wouldn't be surprised. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, she's in it. And she doesn't get a satirical name. I'll just say she's just Mrs. W.
And she's steward of John Hancock.
Yes. Yeah, I would not be surprised. So, yeah. Bye. Thank you for coming. Are there any other questions or thoughts before we adjourn for refreshments? Are there?
No, thank you so much, Betsy.
Oh, thank you for having
It's
me.
been wonderful.
Thanks.
You so much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Can I unclip?